JB here. JB here. Hope everyone's doing outstanding. Friday, July 25th, 9:07 a.m. Talk really quick about the market. Some names I'm looking at go from the S&P futures. We're solidly in the green. Have pulled back. They're pretty much kind of flat here this morning. I'm actually surprised. If you look, Asia markets are in the red overnight. Europe markets are in the red. And considering the S&P just finished at its 15th record high yesterday, a little pull. I'm kind of surprised the market's being pretty resilient. But there's not much in the way of catalysts. I'm sure there'll be more headlines. Maybe some headlines move the markets. I don't know. Uh, Outside of that, it's all eyes on next week. We have the Fed meeting. We have it's well, not an insane, but a lot of earnings. Four of the you got the Google's out of the way, Tesla's out of the way, and now we got Meta and Microsoft on Tuesday, and then we have Wednesday, and then we have Amazon and Apple on Thursday. So uh, trillions of dollars in market cap reporting next week just from those four companies, and then a slew of others. So certainly would be interesting. I had 621 to 636 on the SPY as my range this week, and we didn't get down to 621, but we did get up to 636, 636.15 yesterday, and it was like we got up there for a minute or less than that, and then found resistance, and then boom, we sold off, and then the late afternoon pull almost pulled the S&P into the red for the day. Squeeze out a gain. Dow closed in the red mostly because of IBM, but good stuff. And after the close, I was worried about a surprise, right? Some surprise from Trump and Powell. It offered great entertainment to watch the clips, but outside of that, it was he didn't just go and fire him on TV like he was back on The Apprentice. So that was a good thing. So I think that removes uncertainty, but that chatter is still going to be there, And they asked him question, oh, do you already have who's your next Fed chair? He's like, oh, I got one or two or maybe three, So the thing is, the Fed's going to hold rates next week, right? You got to think that's 100% probability, and then that there's going to be more chatter next week. Next meetings in September, so that's the one when we'll finally cut rates. You would think, but that's that. So overall markets, small caps down over 1.4% yesterday. It's like every time it looks like it's ready to start to run. We had big rallies Tuesday and Wednesday, and then yesterday gives it all back. So hopefully some continuation. It looks like the small caps are outperforming a little bit this morning, up about 0.3%, despite the market being flat and Nasdaq in red. Would be a good sign there. And then the yields conversation. Yields ticked up yesterday. Right now, I didn't even see what they are right now. Yields are higher. Yields are flat pretty much, and then the dollar's higher. So good stuff there. All right. That's overall market. So now just individual names. First RH, right? So RH got those calls when it was like 204 on Wednesday. Boom, all the way up over 210. Locked some in to cover costs. Then, actually, maybe you got them on Tuesday. Whatever the case. Then I was able to lock some more in for over 400%, and then I held some into yesterday. And then yesterday it goes all the way up to almost 225 after the open. And then it just starts to sell off like a slow, meticulous sell off. And then it breaks under 220. And then it didn't show any signs of buyers. So didn't want to lose the rest of the profits on that. So I closed the calls out. Definitely a name I'll continue to revisit. Upper Bollinger Band's 219. So I don't know if that's some of it, but again, has been a nice trade on and off since Liberation Day. Then Reddit, right? So I had Reddit on the watch list yesterday morning as a sympathy trade with Google earnings. I thought, hey, the Google earnings kind of dispel that argument or some of the argument that the AI search or AI is going to supplant search and stop traffic from going to these sites. To me, I think it's the other way around, and it kind of shows that I think Reddit's going to be resilient, not only resilient but show huge growth in its next earnings. I got to look what their earnings date is. I don't know if it's next week, might be the week after, but needless to say that thankfully Reddit wasn't open. The option market didn't open until like 9:33. By then it had sold off the gap. It goes all the way down to 142 and then starts to bounce. But Google was bouncing too. And I looked at Google, I looked at Reddit. Google had to move like $7 to get to the 200 strikes, which were 28 cents at the time. And Reddit, which was like 145, 146, had to go up $9 to get to 155s, which were 28 cents at the time. I thought, which had the higher probability of doing that if we bounce? Figured Reddit. Reddit, thankfully, embarked on a nice rally all the way over 150 until late afternoon. Locked some of the strikes in for close to 100 to cover costs and more for close to 200. Once it broke over 150, and then I held the rest. I'll be watching at the open. It's if you watch Reddit over the last month or so, seems like people pile in right at the open. So I'll be watching that one for a possible, obviously to lock the rest of my strikes in. But I might, if it gets over 150 today and holds, I might look for some strikes in the next week. All right, so that's Reddit. So a lot of earnings next week. I mean, well, there's earnings and then other names I'm looking at into their earnings. But TTD is back almost near those levels it hit after its addition to the S&P. So, I wanted to trade it for premium build into earnings last Monday, and then I got that news about the S&P addition. So those multi bags, 1,000% or so on the calls. But then I want to revisit, so pulled back all the way to $80, a little under 80 earlier this week, and it's been starting to bounce. So back over 85 here. I might look for some like 105s or so, and not that maybe it does get over that on earnings, but the play would be to ride some up into earnings, close some out to cover costs, ride the rest, or take them all off the table and revisit. So that's the thought process there. Same with DXCM. I think they report earnings. I don't know if it's August 7th. But the 105 calls look interesting on a risk reward basis. Finally, it looks like it's set to break out. Tight Bollinger Band set up. So I keep talking about this one. At some point, I'll pull the trigger. There's TTD again. Oh, and then the other one's Align. So Align Technologies reports Wednesday after the close, next Wednesday. It's one of my favorite. I call it an OG. I think I wrote a nice little piece on it back in the day when the stock was like $70. And, back then it wasn't, maybe it was 2013 I wrote this piece. And it was a name that wasn't really well followed, but they were doing accelerated stock buybacks. And then finally, Invisalign became like a household name. I wouldn't say a household name, but I think most people know what it is when you hear it. But it's a stock that's kind of been like lackluster over the last couple of years. And, if you look, it's like a $14 billion company. They've bought back almost $10 billion in stock since 2014. Doesn't mean they deserve a higher valuation. It just means the fundamentals are a heck of a lot better. And when you have a stock when a company that's buying that back that many shares, it's like, I wouldn't call artificially inflate the fundamentals, but not only the fundamentals, but there's less stock out there for buyers, right? So it tends to be very volatile in earnings. Some of the way to play it, and I've done this over the last couple of years. There's way out of the money strikes go nuts before the close on Wednesday. So I might try to trade that. But if you look at the calls, I mean, 240s, 250s, 260s, all expensive on a risk reward basis. But don't be surprised if there's some wacky trade I put on. With the plan would be to lock some in or all before earnings. Same with Roku reports Thursday after close. I mean, this thing's been kind of like stuck since it got over that 90 handle. Just chopping around. Chopping around is not good for premiums, but maybe 105s, 110s into next week, and then lock some in for premium builds before the report. I still love my Joby. Joby remains stubborn. To see it still into the 17s, 1750. It's actually slightly green here this morning. I mean, that's a good sign. You have to think the longer it stays here, that 20 is almost like a foregone conclusion. Like it's going to happen pretty soon. But still have the October strikes, so I'll just hold on to those for now instead of trying to time that move. CDLX 270 it held, and then boom, it broke a little bit under 270, and then thankfully closed back right at 270 yesterday. They report earnings first week, and I think it's August 7th. I think 2 Thursdays, 2 weeks from yesterday. So, still like this one for upside. Still riding the August strikes. I have freebies. Those are still in the green. The Octobers are in the green, so I'll just continue to hold those. I think it melts higher over the next couple of weeks. I'm trying to think of some of the other names. I think that's about it for now. It spies right here at 635. It's funny. I'm trying to do research because you see all these posts. A lot of folks who, they're bullish now. Like Goldman Spectacular came out with like well, actually they're on Market Watch today, right? What did they say on Market Watch? They said, speculative trading is booming. That could turn into a headwind for the S&P 500, says Goldman Sachs. And then you go back to April, and Goldman Sachs had like a 80% recession probability, like all this bearish stuff. And then 2 months later, they revised it up. So it's funny if you go back to April and you find all these articles or pieces or headlines that if you're a trader of options, right? Options are harder than stocks, right? In my humble opinion, right? I'm just going to say, because instead of just working, you can have a great idea. That the company's growing, fundamentals eventually get strong, and you can hold on to a stock and you can average, and eventually that pays out, right? With options, you can, instead of having a stock, you have options, but you're dealing with time, right? So you can be right on your case. The stock eventually, the company could grow and turn into this behemoth that you thought it would, but just your options expire, right? So it's like the same with especially when you trade weeklies and monthlies, you have less time and you're more. You have to have, I wouldn't call mental fortitude, but sometimes you got to be a little crazy, right? So I'm going back to articles, and some of them, like one was from CNN. It says recession is a reality. Let's see if I can find it. And I'll have to paste it there. It says, quote, the economy is weakening, certainly, right? And then you look at the economic data outside of that negative GDP read, which is kind of like an anomaly because the import export data pretty much screwed up all that stuff. I mean, at some point that might show up in the numbers, right? But it hasn't, right? So to say it was a reality, and then you go back to April and you see all these headlines, and you got to trade amidst all these headlines that have not borne fruit, right? They have not come to fruition. So at some point, maybe they do, right? And I keep saying I'm not naive to the fact of that. At some point, inflation is going to get the tariff numbers might show up in inflation, or there might be a pullback or whatever. So you got to be open, right? If you're not open to upside or downside, at some point you get killed. So if you're only open to downside in April and all those headlines, and before that, because those headlines were coming out when the tariffs were going on in Canada and Mexico. So before Liberation Day, there was all those headlines. Most folks were saying, "Oh, we're already in a recession." Back in the first quarter of in February and March of earlier this year, they were saying we were already in recession. That's before the first quarter GDP came out. So all right, rants for other days. Let's have a rock and roll day today. Rock and roll weekend. I'll be back on audio later. Rock and roll.